Good morning. If I could ask people to please find their seats. And if I could also ask you to please be kind enough to put your phones on silence. I am normally the biggest person getting in trouble for that, and it happens almost every day. But if I could ask everyone to please put their phones on silence. Let me welcome all of you this morning. Thrilled to have you here. Really excited about our partnership with Booz Allen Hamilton and the paper we're releasing today on port security, port and zero trust and cybersecurity in our port system. Obviously, the zero trust issue cuts across all of our critical infrastructure sectors, but few are more burning front and center than our ports to both our economy and our national security. So you're going to be hearing a whole lot about that today. And you'll hear from our partners, Brad Medieri, who's an executive vice president at Booz Allen, and Dave Forbes, who has been instrumental in the work we did. Unfortunately, Mr. Batia could not join us today. We just found out yesterday, but we have an amazing panel of other senior leaders from government, industry, and former executives from government, which we will hear from soon. So what we thought we'd do is at the front give a little more of a rundown on some of the key findings of the report. Then Brad and I will go into a fireside chat to get to peel the onion a little further. But before, and then Dave Forbes will be leading a panel discussion with a number of executives in the space. But before we do that, I thought I would welcome and introduce Dave Forbes, who's director of Booz Allen's cyber physical defense portfolio, to give us a tick-tock and a summary. This is going to be short. You're not going to have to sit through an entire report. But Dave, why don't we turn it over to you and go from there?
Thanks, Frank. Having a chance to walk around the room a little bit before getting started, we got a great group here today with a broad range of backgrounds. So Booz Allen and the McCrary Institute joined forces to closely examine the challenges associated with cybersecurity at maritime ports, specifically with an emphasis on the role that deploying advanced technologies at ports can play to better optimize the way that we mitigate vulnerabilities. We specifically look further at the role that potential solutions such as employing a zero trust framework can play to improve the resiliency at our ports, both CONUS and OCONUS. The output of this project, as Frank mentioned, is a paper that was released this week that we want to use to raise awareness of this topic, to stimulate discussion, and I think most importantly, to get out to as many stakeholders as possible to initiate action, right? So this is intended to kind of work in collaboration with governance and directives and so on, so that we can kind of move this issue forward. Next chart. Our ports are critical infrastructure for our economy and national security. So when we all think about the way that we move material and equipment, we do so at our ports. Adversaries are already inside of our port infrastructure, and both government-linked and criminal actors are actively targeting our maritime systems. A particular area of emphasis that we highlight in this project is the maritime transportation system's dependency on the use of Chinese manufactured cranes. This, coupled with vulnerabilities that are associated with outdated operational technology and legacy control systems at ports, continues to raise concerns about the worries that we have about the overall cybersecurity readiness of our infrastructure at ports. Next chart. So, behind the research and the work that we've done on this paper, we've studied a broad range of global cybersecurity attacks that have taken place at our ports, both CONUS and OCONUS. And each one of those provides a use case that allows us to dissect, what vulnerabilities led to an enhanced threat landscape that enabled that attack, and what are some of the things that maybe we weren't doing that we should be considering now going forward. As threats such as those that are continuing to be posed by the PRC and Volt Typhoon continue to become more persistent, the broader risks associated with legacy infrastructure and legacy operational technology, again, becomes more and more concerning. Next chart. So this report provides recommendations focused on policy and technology, because both are important in moving this issue forward. We want this to be a start point for decision makers. And we're kind of charging all of you to participate with us today so that we can go out and get the right people engaged in making further decisions. Central to our work here is examining the port use case and closely looking at the way that zero trust, for example, could be a part of advancing technical solutions going forward at ports to more actively mitigate vulnerabilities. Zero trust is a fundamental shift in the way that we view and defend our enterprise and OT environments. It changes the way we think about cyber defense. So we are here thinking around assuming breach. We know that adversaries are on our networks, they're in our infrastructure. Volt Typhoon has proven this in a broad range of critical infrastructure sectors, and maritime ports can be and should be at the center of that. Zero trust has gained traction at the national level, from the White House to the Department of Defense. And the DoD has mandated the transition to a zero trust architecture by government fiscal year 2027. So the need is there. We need to look at the threat landscape as one continuous battle space where the need for a zero trust-like framework and an assumed breach environment gives us the opportunity to move faster to employ advanced technologies to mitigate these risks. So we want to drive home this idea that the collective ingenuity of both the public and the private sector is needed to come together and continue to move this issue along at a more faster pace. So, in closing, I just want to kind of underscore that today further shows us that cybersecurity is national security. And that's the way that we need to look at it. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it back over to Frank and also introduce Brad Medary, our Executive Vice President and leader of Booz Allen's National Cyber Platform. Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Dave. Brad? All right, so lots to unpack here. In addition to cybersecurity being national security, economic security and national security are inextricably interwoven these days. So I thought we'd start with the backdrop. Dave brought up Volt Typhoon. Obviously, we've got a pacing, or some would say existential threat, which I'm probably in that category, driving some of these issues. This isn't just a cyber issue, it's a China issue and other adversaries as well. So I'd be curious to sort of step back maybe a second and look at the PRC threat in context to be able to better understand why we zeroed in on ports and zero trust and the like.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Thank you for your partnership, and we're super excited that everyone joined us today for this dialogue. Frank, I appreciate your opening remarks on the podium. You talked about TikTok. Just to be clear, we don't support TikTok.
Different TikTok.
But we do know that the PRC is probably watching this conversation with great pleasure. So from a national security perspective, with China and the PRC, I would say the last 3+ years have been, I think, defined by continued escalation. We saw Salt Typhoon, which was the Chinese staging capabilities in our telecommunication infrastructure. We have seen, continued global
Case isn't closed yet, unsolved, right?
Case is not closed. We've seen Volt Typhoon staging capabilities against the power grid and our critical infrastructure sector. In my opinion, Volt Typhoon was probably one of the most significant cyber events that I've seen, because it really starts to cross the line from sort of espionage and IP theft into more kinetic effect, meaning pre-staging capabilities that actually can cause significant disruption and harm to our nation. And I think that we're going to continue to see the PRC continuing to figure out what is our red line. Mm-hmm. And I think in our world today, I think we've been somewhat conditioned around cyber events, right? I think every few weeks there's a major cyber event, and we talk about it for a day or two, and then we're on to the next thing. And so I think that we're in a period of escalation. I think that China's using cyber capabilities to shape influence and exert power. And I think that we're in this forever war in cyberspace, and it's not going to go away.
And just to, not to belabor this point, but if you unpack each of the typhoons on their own, they're significant developments. Collectively, it's kind of the perfect storm to play with the typhoon analogy. And we've seen intelligence preparation of the battlefield for years, but the differentiator with Volt Typhoon is they're actually in our systems, right?
Yeah.
And that was the first sentence of our report, which might get lost, but it's a grabber if you ask me.
Yeah, I mean, the other interesting thing from a PRC perspective, if you rewind 10 or 15 years, and there's a great podcast that it's like a 7-part series that talks about sort of the evolution of the PRC threat. But early on, China was very focused on IP theft, and their tradecraft wasn't overly sophisticated. And what we've seen over the years is this evolution of tradecraft, mm-hmm. and most recently employing living off the land techniques, which are really hard to detect. In the report, we talked about the adversaries in your environment, and we've talked over the years about this whole concept of zero trust. And the whole premise of zero trust, and Dave mentioned this, is assume that you're breached. And it's hard, right? Because we're all spending a lot of money on cyber defense, and we have 24/7 operations. We have the best cybersecurity tools and technologies. But the reality is, a well-resourced adversary, given time and the tradecraft that they're evolving, can and will be in your environment. And I think that we need to continue to adjust our mentality to we are breached, and how are we going to be resilient, and how are we going to hunt down these sophisticated adversaries in our environment?
And I want to transition from the nouns to the verbs. So we're not just here to talk sort of the threat, but we need to understand it in context to understand the urgency that we need to move forward on all of this. And what I'd like is to maybe unpack the concept of zero trust, and then we can drill into what it means for the particular sector.
Yeah, I mean, I was...
So it's not just a buzzword.
Yeah. I was recently doing a tabletop exercise with one of our partners in the Pacific, and we brought together the government entities and the critical infrastructure sector. And as we were kind of walking through the tabletop exercise, we started talking through recommendations, and it sort of became a joke a little bit, because in cybersecurity today, I think the two fundamental recommendations are, one, you need to embrace zero trust principles, and second, you need to start to move at machine speed, by employing artificial intelligence techniques. And so it's really easy to say that, but the reality is it's really generic, and it's become buzzword bingo. I was at the RSA Cybersecurity Conference a couple months ago. And of the 8,000 companies, 4,000 were zero trust, and the other 4,000 were
agentic AI.
Agentic AI. And so I think that we've somewhat done ourselves a disservice by just introducing these really broad concepts that don't mean a lot. And the reality with zero trust is there is no one single silver bullet for implementing zero trust within in your enterprise. I use the term, choose your own adventure. And the reality is, from a zero trust perspective, there's 5 fundamental pillars, and you really need to look in your environment and discern, okay, what are the primary risks? How do I need to increase resiliency? And what are the appropriate controls that I need to implement that will provide the biggest bang for the buck? When looking at deterring a threat actor, the reality is, like I said, well-resourced actors, give enough time and resources, will compromise your environment. As a cyber defender, I think the key thing is you want to convince them that today is not the day, and you want to be able to put the right controls in place that impose cost against them, so that they will turn their forces in other directions.
That's well said, because I do think there is the buzz versus the actual getting it done, and there's a lot of there in the concept, and I think Dave rightfully teed up to an extent why ports, but I think that is a deeper conversation. And again, I recommend everyone read the report, but the Cliff Notes version here. So why did we?
Yeah.
I know the answer, but why did we zero in on ports?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about cybersecurity, it's a fairly like a techie term, right? And when we think of cybersecurity, we think of networks and infrastructure. But the reality is, cybersecurity is national security, and adversaries are using cybersecurity for strategic advantage. And when we look at kind of OT as a whole, I would say that OT environments are plagued with a tremendous amount of technical debt, and operators are concerned about the illities, uptime, reliability, availability, and cybersecurity is something that impacts those key fundamental illities, but most folks aren't fully resourced to be able to protect and defend their environment. One of my colleagues in the audience, Kyle Miller, does a lot of work across the 16 U.S. critical infrastructure sectors, and he and I spend a lot of time talking about the different environments that we walk into. Many environments don't even have someone with the title of CISO or cybersecurity, chief cybersecurity engineer, and so the ports and a lot of these environments, they're plagued by tech debt. They're not, they don't have the mindset from a cybersecurity. Yet when you look at our overall national cybersecurity posture, they present significant risks. I was looking at some facts, and in the report we talk about U.S. ports handle over 40% of the goods entering the United States. And so if you reflect back on the early days of COVID, I remember I went to buy a bike, and the bike shop said, well, your bike is sitting somewhere in the Pacific in a ship. And I'm like, well, when will I be able to get it? And he's like, I don't know, probably 12 to 18 months. And not good for my fitness regimen. But the reality was, the ports were shut down there because of COVID-19. But think about a cybersecurity impact or effect on a port, and it completely disrupts the flow of goods into our nation. And so that will disrupt us in terms of from a consumer perspective. But when you look at ports and national security, our ports are directly impact our military readiness and our ability to defend our nation and our ability to engage in conflict if required. The U.S. military, actually, there are 22 strategic ports that have been designated by the Department of Defense as essential. 17 of those are commercial. So our U.S. military is relying on commercial ports for shipment of, in terms of their critical logistics supply chain. And so from a ports perspective, given, in our report, we talked about the usage of, Chinese equipment and software. That's a huge risk. And, we already know that ports are vulnerable. We saw it in Singapore. We saw it in Seattle in terms of being impacted by ransomware. Well, that's just a criminal organization looking to monetize their tradecraft. And in terms of sophistication, on a scale of 1 to 10, they're probably in the 5 to 6 range. Now, if we look at the PRC trying to disrupt and impact us from a national security perspective, it's pretty easy when their the U.S. ports and a lot of the global ports are running their software, their capabilities, their systems, and so we just think that that creates a significant risk for us as a nation. And I also think that it was interesting when I was talking to someone in the White House a couple years ago about cybersecurity. I said, look, this threat is growing. It's increasing in terms of sophistication. Our national attack surface is continuing to expand. Our risk posture continues to get bigger. Like, how do we defeat this threat? And I was thinking something profound, but he's like, well, it all starts with creating awareness. And like I said earlier, I think the public is conditioned to sort of this cyber thing. It just kind of happens. We accept it. Well, we should not accept the fact that the PRC is pre-positioning capabilities in our critical infrastructure that could cause us harm. We shouldn't accept that the PRC is attacking our telecommunication infrastructure, our defense industrial base, that is pre-staging capabilities, globally. And so I think step one is having a conversation about it, creating awareness, and starting to build a plan so that we can actually start to buy down some of this risk from a national security perspective.
I'm going to try to refrain from my own, but we have been a victim for too long, and we've got to get out of that mindset. And I'm really glad you brought up impeding the ability to project power, because ultimately you have sort of that DoD mission assurance mission, which is essential to our ability to prosecute and fight wars. And then you've got the essential role that Coast Guard, and you've got the essential role that CISA, and we're going to hear from executives from both of them really soon. But it really does blend the Department of Defense, the Homeland mission, and we still look at it a little bit from a bifurcated perspective. So we'll hear more on that in a second. But OT, I think, and these are my words, don't attribute them to Brad, but they've been, in essence, the stepchild of the cyber community for too long. Their essential role is absolutely critical. You're starting to see, we have Tatiana Bolton, who's running a great coalition with us today. You're starting to see recognition in the administration's policies on the importance of OT. How can this be parlayed into other sectors? Because at the end of the day, DOE, energy, industrial control systems, they've taken that seriously for a while. Certainly the big utilities have. But how do we use this as an opportunity to bring in other sectors as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that with OT, I think that OT is I think, of great interest because it's really where the physical world meets the digital world. And cyber impact in an OT environment will directly impact things that we can touch and feel and see every day. Think about the Colonial Pipeline. That's one of the most interesting events to me because within hours of the pipe, and the reality was ransomware hit an external system, and they shut down the pipeline to buy down risk. But the reality was that's a great use case. And think about what that did to us as a nation. Transportation was shut down on the East Coast. In the great state of Virginia, where I live, in Vienna, some of my friends who I saw were trying to pour gasoline into plastic bags. Bad idea. But
yeah.
It shows that events like this.
What does that say about your friend? I'm sorry.
We'll take that one off. We'll take my friends offline. But
don't do it.
But the reality is, it was a terrible idea. But it induced panic and hysteria. And so I think that it's really important for us to start the dialogue about the impacts of cyber on the physical world. And as we talk, regardless of the sector you're in, if you have OT systems, I think a couple things. One is, it's always interesting when I talk to OT operators because when they look at their environment, it's like the Smithsonian of IT. I remember Kyle and I went into a pharma company back in 2017, 2018, and the CISO, at the time, there wasn't a strong connection between the CISO and the OT world. And the CISO actually asked us to go meet with the OT folks and share with them about the risk. And part of the strategy was if the conversation went well, the CISO was a genius. And if it didn't go well, then it was just these two terrible folks that he didn't know that went and talked to them. And thankfully, the conversation went well. And we did a pilot and in one of their OT environments. And what was interesting is when we went into the environment, it literally was, I joke, the Smithsonian of IT, but this was a couple years ago, and they were running Windows NT operating systems. That dates back to like 1995, 1996. And so, the reality with OT environments is you capitalize them over 20 or 30 years. And so they are plagued by tech debt. And so I think, one, starting the conversation around, understanding what's in your OT environment, and back to zero trust, being able to actually look at your environment and start to implement a foundational set of controls that can buy down risk to create a better cybersecurity and resiliency posture. The engagement that I talked about that we did, that organization actually ended up being hit with ransomware 12 to 18 months later. And based upon some of our work in the OT environment, we actually implemented some foundational controls around segmentation. And it actually protected those environments during the ransomware attack. Otherwise, that could have been a catastrophic event for that organization.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because we often focus on the alphabet soup in DC and some of the gaps between agencies, but companies themselves. You normally have a chief security officer and a chief information, and you don't always see, or very rarely do you see, that convergence. And when you look at zero trust, this isn't only the zeros and ones. You've got legacy systems that are essential to whatever services they're providing, and some of them are 30 years old, and some of them are being netted with Internet of Things devices, which bring about old and new vulnerabilities. Windows 95 is a little scary, but I don't think that's there are any patches for that anymore.
I mean, the other interesting thing, in the report, we talk about external comms that are found in some of the crane systems, right? And it's not, unfortunately, it's not dissimilar to what we see in OT environments. And what we'll see is, I remember we were doing an assessment, and I was talking to my colleagues, and the company said, look, our OT environment is segmented away from everything else. And we're like, well, that's kind of weird because we're sitting in McLean, and we had access to their network, their enterprise network, and we're like, well, we're actually sitting on your OT environment right now. They're like, oops. And so I think that what we see is a lot of vendors just add in external comms and other backdoors to support maintenance.
Yep.
But what do adversaries do? Adversaries do survey the environment. They look at the attack surface. They figure out what are the backdoors, and that's how they get in. And just recently, we're doing a massive IR engagement based upon a global company that was hit with ransomware. And they have a huge cybersecurity spend. They got hit by ransomware. That can happen. But they asked us to come in and do an outside-in assessment. And outside-in meaning we did it. We basically just took their entry point into their enterprise and started looking at it like an attacker would, traversing their attack surface. And we put together this presentation. I remember briefing the CISO, and unfortunately, the presentation, each page in the deck had a finding. And once we got up to like slide 50, they politely asked us to stop. And we found just crazy things, in terms of, because now the enterprise, there's tons of SaaS platforms, multi-cloud environment. They had a ton of edge routers with default passwords or no multi-factor authentication. And so, I think it's really important in the OT world. One is, to start to say, look, there is a risk. And by the way, cybersecurity can impact your abilities. And in terms of getting started, start with knowing your environment from an end-to-end holistic perspective. And then you can start to assess the risk. And then you can start to look at this zero trust principles, assuming breach, and putting in a incremental set of controls that helps improve it.
No, that's very well said. That would be my biggest takeaway, but I don't want to put words in your mouth because at the end of the day, I was going to ask about obstacles, but the tyranny of time requires I be a bit of a tyrant. What are the one or two or three takeaways everyone should take from our report? And I do think OT is one of them, and how you integrate that into full visibility. But
yeah, I think one is when we talk about APTs, when I think of APTs, the P is one of the most kind of profound things for me, because our nation-state adversaries are persistent, and meaning that, Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, right? They compromised our environment. Just because we found them doesn't mean they're going to stop. It's a business, and they're in the business of imposing cost against us, and we're in this forever state of cyber warfare. And so, one, I think recognizing that we're in a persistent battle. The second piece is, especially in the OT world, what I was talking about. One is really understand your environment, understand your risk posture, and really start to have a roadmap for how you can start to implement the right controls. I mean, those are probably the two key takeaways, Frank.
awesome. And I like the persistent side because they are holding our critical infrastructure at risk, and that's a signal as well. So, Brad, thank you for sharing some very insightful thoughts, not only on the paper, but more generally. I want to reintroduce Dave Forbes, who's going to kick off a discussion with a great panel, and I'll let him introduce. Thank you.
You guys all set?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to get started here with our panel. Been very eager to have the chance to continue the conversation that I've had with this group actually this week in advance of this event. We started to uncover some really compelling issues that we're going to continue to pull on today, and really appreciate Frank and Brad further teeing up the issues around maritime port security. And what we've done today is we've assembled what we think represents the range of organizations involved in this issue. And I'm very pleased to introduce to my far left Steve Casapula, who is the Acting Chief Strategy Officer at DHS CISA. I'm also pleased to be joined by Emily Park, who represents the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, and by Sam Stevens. Sam is the former captain of the Port of Virginia and the former Director of Intelligence for the Coast Guard Atlantic area. So really excited to have them here. And what I want to do just for a couple of minutes, starting with Steve, is just go down the row and give them a chance to kind of talk a little bit about their role and their lens on this issue before I try my best to ask them some really difficult questions. Steve.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks to you all for coming. Thanks to Frank and the McCrary team for hosting this. I think it's a very important conversation. As Dave said, I'm Steve Casapula, Acting Chief Strategy Officer at CISA. I've been there about 7-8 weeks now. And this is an issue very near and dear to my heart. Aside from Sam, I'm probably the only licensed merchant mariner in the room. I went to the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, so have grown up in a maritime world, been to most of these ports on the West Coast and throughout Asia, so very near and dear to my heart. So thank you for highlighting this very important industry. And look forward to this discussion. I'm excited that people continue to raise this and want to talk more and more about it. So excited to get started.
Hello, I am Emily Park. I am a professional staff member working for Ranking Member Peters on the Senate Committee for Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. If you're less familiar with Senate HISGAC, that's totally fine. We are the primary committee of jurisdiction for DHS, for the Office of the National Cyber Director, and for a lot of other really exciting, fun governmental functions. And what I love the most about my job is, as the lead for cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, I get to have a lot of exciting conversations with folks that people on the Hill that normally wouldn't have conversations with. So we've done a lot of work the past 2 years talking with critical infrastructure sectors across the nation, including maritime and ports, and some of the folks that work in those areas, including Coast Guard. So this really just builds on some work we've been doing for the last 2 years, and I'm happy to talk about it today.
Good morning, everyone. Sam Stevens, and it's really an honor to be here among so many professionals and esteemed panelists. And I love the topic. Ports and their centricity to the United States are something we've always been trying to do in the Coast Guard. You know, 90% of GDP, as we heard, 40% of our goods here. And I got to have one of the best jobs of my career being the captain of the Port of Virginia from 2020 to 22, getting to see it up close and personal, climb aboard the 170-foot tall ship-to-shore cranes and see them up close and go into the power shacks and see them work, but also the rest of the marine transportation system or the maritime transportation system, which unless you're there, ports kind of are an esoteric, like it's ports, it's quays, it's waterways, but it's just water. You see the complexity of the port and the lifeblood that it provides to the United States, having this narrative be like, this is where the rubber meets the road for our livelihood and our prosperity is pretty important. So also appreciate the comments of sharing strategic ports with military installations, and was also blessed to be part of, you know, our port is like we called it in Virginia, you know, the United States Navy, the greatest Navy in the world. It really is. Hoorah, Craig. It was great to be a partner with them, but to see the number of intricacies that go into a port and sharing partnerships across the recreational, defense, and commercial sectors. So it's really an honor to be here and to be able to talk about a subject so important.
Yeah, thanks, Sam, and thank you all for your perspectives there. So getting into the business here, let's visit the threat. We've talked a lot about threat in Chinese cranes and so on to tee up this discussion. You guys are living it from different perspectives. So what maritime threat activity exists that is most pressing and concerning to you? And Sam, I want to start with you as an operator. When you think about threats from the Coast Guard's perspective, protecting these ports, you know, what comes to mind and what are you worried about?
Absolutely, Dave. You know, we responded at Sector Virginia several times to some very nascent cyber attacks, which were often revealed with very ambiguous information. And that would be in maybe a ship reporting an anomaly or an irregularity with a bridge navigation system, or with something amiss with a particular server. And as captain of the port, the duty was to try to ascertain, not necessarily with cyber specifics and resolution, but what are the operational risks and what do I need to do to make sure the port can continue running, carrier strike groups can continue to exit and enter the port, and commercial commerce can keep going. And so that might range from an inbound vessel. You know, if you head out the Potomac River here, you sail southeast, you'll hit the Chesapeake Bay and you head all the way down to the Virginia Capes, which is Cape Henry and Cape Charles, and that was the port and waterway that we controlled. So pretty tight channel there and pretty important to the lifeblood of the whole eastern seaboard here with the Port of Virginia. So if you had a vessel with position, navigation, timing, or regularity, or something that you just couldn't respond to, my initial action was to put a captain of the port order on it requiring tug escort in through the Chesapeake Bay Bridge tunnels, recognizing that if you had something like a motor vessel Golden Ray, which happened in Brunswick Sound, it was a car carrier that capsized, or you had a motor vessel Dolly sort of situation in which you had a large container vessel run aground or have something happen and block the channel, we effectively have the in and outbound port framework is blocked. What do we do with that? And then moving into, facilities and the K and the pier, we very much were aware of the ZPMC cranes, Port of Virginia and that area. Again, we shared a great partnership, but you can see public open source information. A lot of cranes there, but I was also really impressed with the number of partnerships that the entire group, me as captain of the port, FBI as the Federal Maritime Security Coordinator, kind of co-chair, would look at to make sure what can we do to understand our environment, as Brad said, so that we can double down on making sure they're as operationally sound as possible. And then finally, knowing what happens if something goes south. What's the resiliency built into the system to be able to get us back on board? What are the rerouting, or what are the other terminals that we could look at? So I feel like I've gone long. I'll stop there.
No, Sam, that's great. So Steve, it says that you're thinking about threats every day. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll actually take a slightly different tack to answer this question. I mean, I agree with everything Sam has said, but also, Volt Typhoon was mentioned, the persistent access and the persistent presence was mentioned. We still don't actually know what the result of that is going to be, right? So they are in those systems. They are in those systems on the island of Guam, as has been talked about publicly. So what is the resulting impacts going to be from a threat perspective? And so that's the stuff that we're really looking very hard at, is how do we mitigate that threat, but also what is their end goal? Is it to merely disrupt a few cranes at a port? That could be one thing, but what about if it were all ports? What about if it were all cargo management systems? So they don't have to do anything physical. They can just shut down a database and limit our ability to track cargo that moves on and off of ships, effectively shutting down the ports and the entire transportation system that way. So those are the kind of second, third order effects that I also worry about, in addition to the cyber physical convergence there.
Great. So Emily, any thoughts on it from how this threat makes its way to where you are? And is this consistent with what you're worried about on the Hill?
Absolutely. I would say probably about a year and a half ago, we started talking with the House Chinese Select Committee about what they were working on, what they were seeing, because what they've been doing for the last 2 years now is looking at a lot of the U.S. domestic critical infrastructure sectors and saying, where are we most vulnerable to potential PRC actions there? And so last year they came out with a great report talking about the cranes in ports and what kind of vulnerabilities exist there. I will make sure to say that the report did not say that they found actual vulnerabilities. They did not say that they found actual incidents of PRC intrusion in ports, but it definitely highlighted this issue of that we were relatively unaware of, I would say 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So the report and the discussions on the Hill now is very much, what should we be doing now? What should we be looking at next? Where is the next crane issue going to pop up?
And that's really helpful. And, Emily, kind of going back to you, so we talk about the threats. Every one of you kind of brings in the cranes into the discussion. So existing policies and directives, right? Leading up to this event, in our discussions, we're citing policies, directives, old ones, new ones. Emily, which ones matter most to you? Then which ones are the ones that you think are most prevalent in our day-to-day?
Sure. Well, no surprise to anyone here, I'm a huge champion for CISA 2015. The Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 was this foundational bedrock information sharing framework that allowed private sector organizations to share both amongst themselves and also with federal agencies. This authority expires September 30th. And if you're not a little bit concerned about that upcoming expiration date, you should be. We have been working for the last year to try and get an authorization and extension across the finish line, but so far it hasn't happened. And as we're about to go into August recess, where all members kind of go home, We then turn around and come back in September and have 30 work calendar days, which is something like 20 business days to actually get the CISA 2015 extension across the finish line. Now, there's a lot of champions for this in Congress on both sides, on the Senate and House side, but there's a lot of naysayers as well. And 10 years ago, it was very, very difficult to get CISA 2015 signed into law. It took something like 3 full calendar years to go from start to finish and signed into law. So we know that the expiration of this authority will have significant impacts across all of critical infrastructure, including maritime and ports, because a lot of what critical infrastructure does is when it shares this information, it often shares it through mechanisms that are either explicitly or implicitly using CISA 2015 authorities. So if you're a crane operator, if you are a port authority governing body, and you're sharing cyber threat information through JCDC with CISA, through Coast Guard, through other authorities, or if you're sharing information through ISACs or ISOWs, a lot of these will be impacted. We can expect roughly, potentially, if this expires, maybe an 80 to 90% reduction in cyber threat information flows, like raw flows. But that doesn't say anything about the break in trust that will occur as well, because at its core, CISA 2015 as an authority is about trust and being able to trust the businesses and organizations around you and being able to trust the federal government that it will use the information you share with it. So if you are concerned now, I would ask you to, just go back and do an assessment of, if you're a critical infrastructure organization, where you're getting your cyber threat information from and who you're sharing it with. And if you have additional questions, always happy to talk about it more. I could spend hours and hours talking about CISA 2015. So we need everyone's help to get it across the finish line before it expires September 30th.
Yeah, Emily, great. Steve, I know you're going to have thoughts on this. Love the Hill talking a lot about CISA, and happy to be able to facilitate this collaboration. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. So, from a CISA perspective about CISA 2015, we certainly support a clean reauthorization. Our nominee, Sean Planky, talked about this in his confirmation hearing last week in front of the committee. So we are looking forward to doing all we can to support Congress acting on the reauthorization.
Awesome.
No, that's great. And Sam, briefly, operator on the ground, are you guys worried about regulations when you have vessels afloat, looking at infrastructure, dealing with threats every day? How are you guys viewing this from a Coast Guard perspective?
I mean, as the Maritime Regulatory Agency, you've seen the evolution of Navigation Vessel Inspection Circular, which was some initial guidance to the final rule that came out in January. It goes into effect here in July with requirements, to respond more accurately and effectively to National Response Center calls and notifications, cybersecurity operators, plans, et cetera. So the regulatory framework is definitely an area that we're pushing into. Of note, it does create a dance, though, with, for instance, Coast Guard Cyber still operates in an area that is willing and able. We would offer our services for a request for technical authority, and I'm not saying we, but the cyber teams that go out. We recently have done 7 missions in 7 of these seaports with the cranes. That is an area where industry, from my experience, is a little bit skeptic. The Coast Guard is a regulator. What will the results of a cyber protection team assessment do? And is there, permissiveness then to make these results that are maybe not so favorable better, or will there be a regulatory schwack? And so that's something I've talked with a lot about my colleagues about. So short answer, regulations are the foundation by which you set the bar. So.
Sam, that's great, and that's another segue into this topic, right? And that's the number. You guys all have kind of, whether you realize it or not, revealed the number of stakeholders that are involved in maritime port security. And I got to tell you, in the research and conversations that we did in the report leading up to all of this, I had a conversation with one particular stakeholder who spent a lot of time on this topic and very, very succinctly said to me, "Who's in charge? Are you asking me about public sector, private sector? Who brings the money? Who are the stakeholders that really are going to drive technology changes at ports? even, close colleagues and others say that this is a real issue. We're not going to solve it here, but Emily, let's talk about the multiple stakeholders. How are we navigating that, and what are you seeing?
I will say over the last 10 years, I would draw a trend that communication is improving as the trust improves between the multiple stakeholders. And when we say stakeholders and the communication that they're having, it's stakeholder entities that, the multiple entities that are at the ports themselves, and then also, the regulators coming in, looking at the different issues at the ports potentially, or the Coast Guard teams coming in and doing assessments. That kind of communication has improved. It's not perfect, probably won't be perfect for a while, but I would say things have gotten quite a bit better, and I would just attribute that to the focused guidance and leadership over the last 5 years that has recognized the importance of it.
Great. Steve, any thoughts on collaboration, good points, bad points, challenges?
Yeah, I mean, Emily talked about the improvement. I think that's evident in how we talk. I mean, CISA's role as the national coordinator, how we work with all 16 critical infrastructure sector risk management agencies, SRMAs, right, is really critical. Our work with JCDC, with private industry. But I also think it's part of that approach from a leadership perspective, in that we have to engage people where they are. So you mentioned about who's in charge, who's going to lead on this, right? Some of those personal relationships that we may need to develop a little bit more fully with some of these departments and agencies. And so I'll point to the Maritime Administration, which does a lot of work with cranes and ports and our ready reserve fleet and everything like that. They are taking a lot of action with the president's EO that he just signed. So I think deepening the relationships across government there are really going to help, because when we talk to owners and operators and we get down to the details and they say, okay, you're telling us these cranes are a problem. We're telling you they're very expensive. They're supposed to be 20 or 30-year pieces of equipment, and you want us to replace them, and you want us to spend 1.5 or 2 times more to replace them. Where is that money coming from? Is that a grant from the Maritime Administration? Is that a grant from DOT writ large? Is there private sector money that could come into play here? All those types of conversations need to happen with the right people in the room. So deepening those relationships and that communication, I think, is critical to when you get down to the details and you're actually talking about solutions, how to replace cranes or other equipment that may not be as costly as cranes. How do we address that? It has to start with having the right people in the room.
Steve, that's a great tee up for this transition from policy to technology, right? So you basically touched on the tech debt that Brad mentioned in the fireside chat. I see Sherry and others in the room, secure by design. All these things are pathways that we need to follow, but it's going to take a long time to get there, right? So, this issue around maritime port security has largely been a policy discussion. One of the things that got us going with McCrary on this topic was all of the policy dialogue, which is extremely important. But let's talk about introducing advanced technologies. When we're trying to solve changing out very expensive cranes globally and who's going to pay for that, how do we protect the infrastructure that we have? So let's get into the engineering aspects of it here a little bit. So I would say, Steve, I'm going to go back to you because I read something interesting last night about CISA and zero trust framework. How are we now, and how can we move faster on technology and advanced technology, cyber technology testing at ports?
Yeah, so I think, again, it goes back to that partnership with Coast Guard, with critical infrastructure owners and operators, but also having them understand some of the basic cyber hygiene practices that should be in place at the ports, and then leveling up from there. And so when they're doing testing, when they're looking at their OT environments, when they're looking at their attack surface, is understanding what's really on their network. How many routers do they have? What's the life cycle of those? I mean, I think those are all basic questions that, again, CISA can come in and do some assessments and help with that, but also the companies and the organizations that run these ports need to understand this is what starts. You have to do that inventory. You have to level set and understand what's on your network. And if you're doing upgrades and if you're going to adopt new technologies, that needs to be part of the calculus as well.
Yeah, Steve, that's great. You hit a really key point. I'll mention in a second. So, Emily, you guys are working on legislation and bills and the NDAA and all those things. How do we Steve talks about testing. How do we get to a point where we're doing those assessments and we're actually validating inventory so that we can test zero trust principles? We see what works and scale.
Absolutely. So I would say the federal agencies here really need to be setting a high bar, because we expect them to have a high bar because they have so much expertise, they have the time, the funding, the expertise to do this. So they have this responsibility to set the stage, to be an example for the rest of the critical infrastructure owners and operators to follow, especially in the maritime sector. I think CISA has done a great job of this, especially ZTA, the guidance that y'all have put out recently, all the demonstrations you've done, the tools and guidance that's been put out. Coast Guard also been doing a great job. But then we go to the other big part of and federal agency that's present in ports, and that's a DOD. And they maybe haven't been doing as good of a job lately. They've been trying, and we've been nudging and nudging and nudging. And when it comes to zero trust architecture, there's a lot of foundational principles for ZTA, one of which is, phishing resistant authentication mechanisms and making sure that you have legacy equipment that's off net or mitigated so that you don't have this constant attack vector that is phishing, which we all know is, a pretty significant vector for so many attacks. We just got some language into NDAA report text, which if you haven't seen it yet, that's fine, because it's also like 1,000 pages, so it's quite a bit to read. But we finally are, really forcing DoD to demonstrate compliance with these basic principles of zero trust architecture, which is you must have phishing resistant authentication mechanisms, and you must transition off legacy equipment that can't support phishing resistant authentication. We think that, CISA's done a great job of showing that it's possible and that it's, one of these baseline ZTA fundamentals that really closes a significant attack vector. So kind of putting money where the mouth is, making sure that some of our biggest agencies who are part of this problem is also demonstrating the solutions that are there.
Emily, that's really helpful, and I think detailed, and I wanted to ask you that because you had done a great job over the past few days explaining this. Sam, Coast Guard, again, patrolling. You were a director of cyber for the Atlantic area. Zero trust technology, cyber technologies. What do you think about that? Is it happening now, and what does the Coast Guard not have that they wish they did?
How much time do we have again, Dave? just curious. Just a quick couple of responses. I love this discussion, one about trust, which Emily teed up, and the number of frameworks in a port. And it's just remarkable across this continuum of plan and prepare, detect and respond, investigate and attribute. And that's a spectrum which requires a whole lot of planners and intelligence community networkers and emergency managers and pilots association, Customs and Border Protection. So the port communities that run on that continuum really are trying to lead on the leading edge of planning and preparedness. What do we know? What do we know about our environment, which Steve and Brad talked about? And then the detect and respond is, what does our worst day, digital day look like, and how do we get back on our feet? And then, of course, the investigate and attribute is that partnership a little bit more national in the IC. But that trust flows over, I believe, just speaking to the last question about zero trust technology and implementation, is the trust from industry that those stakeholders have their best interests in mind and are sharing. And even though the information can't always come back out of TS or secret enclaves back to them, that the actions that are being done, whether they're policy or legislative, are actually with that knowledge in mind. But the other thing that I think is a real a difficult one to get after is the natural competitiveness of industry, because as was teed up, these legacy operational technology systems are like trying to take an old steam railroad and convert it to a magnetic high-speed train. Do you do that on the existing rail system and just try to hack it, or do you just build a new railroad? And so I feel like in many ways, who is the industry who's going to step up or have the support from the federal government to do it, pilot it, and then what are the trade-offs for their supply chain decrements? Like, all right, we're going to try this out, but what's going to happen? And how much undoing are we going to have to do to redo? And then if we do get a competitive advantage, are we going to share that, or it's pretty cool, we'll hold on to that because now it gives us a competitive advantage. So I'd like to see it turn from not just my port to our nation's ports in trust in information. So that was where I wanted to go. From a Coast Guard perspective, can you repeat the last part of your question? I got excited about this.
Yeah, I think you hit it, but just advanced technologies as operational advanced technologies, zero trust. Do you see a framework where you employ these at ports? Is it happening now, and what do you wish you were able to do in the near term?
Yes. If you could wave a magic wand and a genie out of a bottle said, grant me 3 wishes, and if suddenly, ship-to-shore cranes were manufactured out of the United States at a competitive rate, and we could just flip them all, that would be a no-brainer. And have the zero trust technology applied. I think that would be a no-brainer. The question that is very real and tactical is, what are the costs? What are the costs of commerce? What are the implementation costs? What does the trial and error period look like? And across this really deep network system of systems in a port, where you talk about mom and pop operators who are still using paper charts and just chugging along, no pun intended, to more sophisticated industry players. And then, like Emily said, it was a big work to work with the Navy across the other side of the river. And how do we share information in that domain when most of the stuff in DoD is a bit cloistered? We're not going to share. We'll take your stuff, but we're not going to share our stuff. And that's not competitive. It just is. Over.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. So Emily and Steve, it seems like we have a real opportunity here, right? And Emily, you mentioned a few days ago we were talking about the role of federal leadership. Talk a little bit about Emily, then Steve. What is the opportunity we have here with the timing, the point where we are in the fiscal year, new leadership in place? What's the opportunity? Who should be stepping up, and how do we take advantage of this moment?
Absolutely. I feel like now is definitely the time to shine for some of the federal agencies, especially as they come in and have these new Senate confirmed leaders, thinking about, the new nominee for CISA director, Sean Planke, thinking about the new National Cyber Director nominee, Sean Cairncross. It's funny that both cyber director peoples are Sean's, but that's great for them. We have, lots of points of view that are coming in. We're having leadership changeovers. We're having new ideas, fresh folks coming into agencies, especially from industry. So right now I think is definitely a key moment for CISA, for DoD, for Coast Guard to really take ownership of this problem and say, here we are, we're ready. Here's our ideas for how we can help and how we can move the needle actually practically implementably.
Yeah, agree with all that, but also I'll just highlight the obvious, right? Because we're all here. Events like this, organizations like this, papers, discussions, panels, all help move the needle as well, because governments can't do it alone, right? Agencies can't go it alone. They have to collaborate, but also that collaboration with the owners and operators, with the folks who have practiced in this space, with the folks who are thinking about these types of things, because we don't have all the answers at any one specific agency. So that partnership and that dialogue is really critical to sorting out when you, again, like I said before, when you get down to the details, who's going to pay for it? What type of technology should we start with? What area should we begin with, right, in terms of changing over, OT tech or something like that? When you get down to those details, where do we start? The owners and operators have to be part of that conversation. It can't just be a top-down approach. So those continuous conversations and dialogues are just so critical. I know our nominee, I almost called him our director, our nominee is extremely excited about this. He's a Coast Guard veteran, so he has a long history of service in this area. We are excited as an agency to work with owners and operators. And, the other thing I'll acknowledge is, ports and the maritime sector are reliant on the other sectors. So water, wastewater, energy and power. So it's critical, too, that we have those relationships as well. So everyone is kind of part of that same conversation and understands what we're trying to do. So if the power goes out at a port, we don't have issues all over. And, we can talk about reliability and resilience across sector, too, not just in one sector.
Excellent stuff here. So in closing, and before we take some questions from the field, I want to give you a chance to just kind of provide your short thoughts on near-term things that you'd like to see happen from your organization, your lens. For an example, right, as an industry leader, we have a responsibility to identify and test solutions that support you. what can we deploy to a port that can function and scale and actually do what we're saying it can do, and that's building architectures and working with our partners. And that's when we walk out of here today, that's what we need to continue to do. Sam, from a Coast Guard perspective, what are those near-term things that you guys are focused on?
I believe it's this information sharing, it's the trust that pilots and betas in this domain will be shared, and we will see the industry, I'm not saying that it's purely competitive, but that industry competitors by nature will see themselves as one holistic system that provides for the prosperity of the United States, which at the end of the day is our posture as a country. That sounds a bit pie in the sky, I know, but at the end of the day, that's, I believe, where we need to go so that the proprietary solutions that are protected and these opportunities for risk are shared. What does sharing look like? I'm not an economist or a finance specialist, but I know that there's probably got to be dollars behind that, where whether it's through grants or revenues. An interesting fact, the statistic's a little old, but during 26th Commandant's time, the Maritime Commerce Strategic Outlook said that there was $5.6 trillion of economic activity per year in the maritime transportation system across the ports and the inland rivers. And if you just imagine if you taxed a bit of that or you took a bit of that and then reinvested it into grants or into the actual economic revenue into the solutions that we're trying to do and said, well, let us buy some of the risk for you. So that's kind of where my head goes with that, is how do we implement, but how do we create a trust fabric that allows people to do it without risking either their business and allows the industry to share?
So I'll offer a short, a medium, and a long term. So short term, we got to get CISA 2015 extended before September 30th. We got to make sure that that trust, foundational trust that it offers, continues in the cybersecurity community. So medium term, have to make sure that the federal agencies are appropriately funded and have the right personnel in the right roles. We're seeing a lot of departures from CISA. We're seeing a lot of uncertainty in the federal workforce. What does that mean for the important roles that these agencies play, short, medium, long term? So a lot of questions still unanswered there about what CISA will look like, what some of the Coast Guard groups will look like in the medium term. And then long term, I think continuing to clarify the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders. Whether we have, a rewrite of PPD 41 and make sure that the incident response plan is very, very clear and concise. Whether we look at, do we need to add more critical infrastructure sectors? Do we need to remove some, consolidate some? There's a lot of thinking in this space right now, which I think as we continue to grow and develop and mature in our understanding of what the cybersecurity threats are, we can see a lot of improvements there in the long term.
Yeah, and from a CISA perspective, I would just ask for that continued partnership that I talked about before. And, it's taking a good hard look at your organization, what's on your network, what areas you need to improve, and then also working with us, whether you want assessments done or you want to participate in some of our exercises and take advantage of our after-action reports or our field presence, right, to have us come in and partner with you to take a look at some of those questions and then figure out where to start, right? That's something we hear from a lot of organizations as well. I know I have some issues. Where can I start, right? So it was mentioned before, some multi-factor authentication, some phishing resistance type things, right? Start small and it leads to big. So that's what I kind of want to leave you with here, that continuing partnership. CISA's always ready to have a phone call or do a site visit, so feel free to let us know how we can help.
Yeah, thank you all for those those summary comments. I'd like to take a few minutes to see if there's any. We got 10 minutes to roughly to get some questions from the field here. Questions, thoughts from the group?
It's okay if there are none. All right, I can't resist. Maybe I'll put Emily on the spot a little bit, although all three panelists, all of you have talked about it. There are no single sector cyber issues. We've talked about, of course, maritime and the transportation sector. That's not even the whole of the transportation sector, but then also power, water, all of these come to play. So, from a policymaker's perspective, where do you see the future? You alluded to PPD 41 rewrite of really getting to the cross-sector, the ecosystem cooperation that's needed for cybersecurity, because we need the sector risk management agencies and their expertise on their sector, but we really need to I think from a policymaker level, push more of that cross-sector, because you can't just protect the water or the power or the cranes. All of those things are required to really get to cybersecurity. So I'm just curious as to the thoughts on that.
Totally. So I will say part of what we see is like this cross-sector risk management portfolio when it comes to cyber. It's very important that we have a strong national cyber director, because that ultimately, like when we created that role, that person is supposed to come in and be able to look holistically across critical infrastructure sectors and say, here are the trends. Let's work together with CISA. Let's work together with some of the other agencies. Let's work together with critical infrastructure, and let's all row the canoe in the same direction together based on the statistics and the trends that we're seeing. And so looking forward to seeing what Sean Cairncross, if he has confirmed, will do in that role. And obviously making sure that the Office of the National Cyber Director continues to get the appropriate funding and personnel that it needs to continue in its critical function. So when we think like top down as well, CISA in its role as national coordinator and SRMA for something like 9 critical infrastructure sectors, 8, because it's co-SRMA for one of them. Yes, thank you very much. So making sure that the kinds of services that CISA can offer when you are a critical infrastructure owner or operator, calling to CISA saying, hey, we got a problem. I'm seeing this, or I'm seeing that, or I need help, and I think my neighbor's also impacted. CISA sits at that very unique position where it can offer some of these critical technical services and also some of this communication services through JCDC, which allows for that cross-sector collaboration to happen. So continuing to make sure that JCDC matures and evolves and can continue on that North Star path of being that communications gateway, that center point for CISA.
Got time for one more question. We have one out there. Tom?
Hi.
Yeah.
It's really not a question, it's a comment. You need to incentivize people to do what you have to do, and you led with a little bit of the cost, and it's onerous, and rules are onerous. But my observation, and I'm a businessman, is that these ports do compete with each other. Is that correct? When the Key Bridge came down, Baltimore was shut down, the traffic flowed someplace else. And so in Darwinism, survival of the fittest. So when there's a massive cyber attack and a bunch of ports are shut down, those that keep operating will be in business and do very, very well. So that's a little bit of a carrot that goes along with the stick of the cost. That's just a comment. You can react to that if you want, or I just thought I'd throw that out there as you go off trying to sell this sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. I'm happy to talk about resilience all day. Also happy to talk about the interconnectedness. We talk here about cross-sector, but also one of my favorite words in the English dictionary is intermodalism. So a port doesn't flow or exist or work or operate without trains, planes, automobiles, right? And ports. So having that interconnected nature, building that resilience like you talked about, and having all of the infrastructure be more resilient and addressing those cyber risks ahead of time, left of boom, is so critical. So thank you for that comment.
And I think the other thing, and again, Brad brought this up, is cyber actors are learning organizations. So once successful, the rest will come down. So with a cyber attack, all right, we got through, they're going to learn, they're going to adapt, and they're going to figure out where they can attack. And I think that's the thing where coming and pulling together is so important.
Great. Thanks for those thoughts. And I want to thank our panel up here. I really appreciate your time this morning. An excellent discussion. And with that, on behalf of Frank and McCrary and Booz Allen, I want to thank everyone for being here today. We're going to close and hopefully have some discussion after the event and continue this dialogue. So thank you, everybody, for your time today.